I hit go. So technically, there was a minute left. So I'm not lying to anybody. Although I may have said 5 minutes at 6:54.
Yeah. He's Roland, he's working on it.
It's working. We're up and running. It should be live. Everything's working. I just had to restart my OBS, but
Cool. All right. I mean, I don't know if you want to like kind of introduce yourself a little bit just for any of like the chatters here who don't know you. And then I can probably do the same for your chatters.
yeah. So I am Lactoid. Um, Me and my tanky friend here, non-smoker, we had a spirited discussion on Wix panel, and I think I think we both agreed there was some unresolved ground, and we wanted to go over that. So yeah, you can find me on Lactoid TV, which is a lot easier to remember than my former name, which was Anti-Communism United. Believe it or not, I changed that probably a couple weeks ago just for uh, conciseness' sake.
Right. So is the name of just to clarify, is the name of your Twitch Lactoid TV?
Yep, Lactoid TV, Lactoid TV.
I got it. All right. We were trying to give you a shout out in the chat, so I just wanted to clarify that. Cool. Yeah. I mean, for anybody on your end, my name is Non-Smoker. I'm a Marxist-Leninist Twitch streamer. Uh, Probably one of the few left, I would say. No pun intended on Twitch. Um, yeah, Lactoid kind of, gave a pretty good summary, but we had a discussion that I felt like there was a lot of unresolved things, and I also find panels to be an incredibly ineffective way to have a conversation. It's just too difficult to give everybody the proper time to like completely express themselves, and they're also it's about getting viewers. I mean, every stream should be, but particularly panels. You have a lot of viewers all at once, potentially. And I find that like I tend to overperform a little versus one-on-one discussions, which I try to be a little bit more serious, formal. So but yeah, okay. I mean, I guess we could just jump right into it. So do I take it correctly, Lactoid, you're a libertarian, right?
Yeah, so, and this is something I wanted to talk about a little bit, and I've been wanting to talk about this for a little bit now, even if this discussion never happened. So I would define myself as a libertarian, but I only go with identity descriptions for convenience's sake. I'm not really big into gatekeeping. I personally don't put a lot of value in the title of libertarian or the identity of libertarian. I've had people tell me, Lactoid, you're not a real libertarian. I don't give a fuck. I don't care. I don't care if somebody thinks I am a Marxist Leninist, right? If they want to use that term to describe me, whatever. I think what's most important is actually exploring the ideas. And because I think my ideas are most consistent, but not completely, but most consistent with the modern libertarian movement, I just I just use that word as a easy explanatory. The reason I wanted to say that is because there's a lot of I don't know. There's other libertarian streamers who are much more into gatekeeping and much more into identity, I think, than I am.
No, I mean, look, I appreciate that. I actually think being dogmatic is dumb, and it also it kind of like I mean, you keep using the term gatekeeping, and I get why, because people who are like that also tend to do the, what is it, the no true Scotsman fallacy a lot, and like they basically try to push people away from unifying politically. Um, and I think it's a major problem on the left, major, major, major problem. Everybody wants to have their own special ideology, and it has its orthodoxy, and if you don't meet that criteria. You're not a real communist. You're not a real socialist, whatever. So I get that, and it sounds, to me that just means you're kind of an open-minded, relatively independent thinker, which is good.
I try to be.
Yeah. Cool, man. So, okay, yeah, I was actually talking about this before. I feel like this is a good jumping off point. But with the whole libertarian thing, I kind of feel like libertarians and Marxist Leninists oddly agree on certain things pretty consistently. The number one being anti-war, a general anti-war sentiment. Is that something that you feel like we might have some middle ground on?
Um, Maybe, but actually maybe not. So I agree with you that most libertarians are anti-war, uh, especially like the when you get to like the anarcho-capitalists and those people. I mean, they're hyper anti-war. Um, I I'm less anti-war if the war is done for a proper ideological purpose. So if the purpose is to and we could both come up with examples in which we're both pro-war, right? I'm assuming that you were in favor of invading Nazi Germany. I was very much in favor of invading Nazi Germany. I am totally fine with invading fascist nations and overthrowing their governments and replacing them. I think we might have a different idea about what kind of government they should be replaced with, but definitely replacing them with different governments because I don't think that people's rights change depending on what side of an imaginary border they're on. And so, if their rights are being violated, that can justify self defense or defense of others in this case, even across state lines or nation lines, right? In the same way I could defend my neighbor or defend some old lady being robbed of her purse, I should also be able to defend somebody from being gassed, right?
Sure. I mean, okay, it's interesting that answer. Like, I definitely agree on part of it, right? Like, of course, I would have supported and retroactively support a war against Nazi Germany. I don't see how anybody could really reasonably not support that.
Oh, there's some people.
Well, yeah, other than, radical fascists. I mean, people who are trying to argue that from a pure anti-war perspective, I think that's a difficult argument to make, but you're right. Some people probably do. Um, but okay, I do take some issue with the second part of that, and I guess it's because it's my own fault for not explicitly defining what I mean by anti-war. I'm an American. I take it you're an American too. We both speak as Americans. And when I talk about being anti war, I'm really mostly referring to American foreign policy post Second World War. So I would say that, in my view anyway, there really hasn't been a justified foreign intervention since the Second World War. How do you feel about that statement?
I think there are examples of unjustified military interventions. The clearest one being Iraq, I think, was an unjustified and overall fruitless military intervention. I would disagree, though, that all military interventions were pointless. I think we actually did disagree on the last panel about Korea specifically. I think Korea was an example of a justified military intervention. Um, I thinking through it, I'm sure I can name others. I don't think Libya was, just based on how it was done. Perhaps if it was done differently, but I also share that opinion about Vietnam, and that's where I lose most people. I think if Vietnam was done correctly, it could have been justified, but when you drop the ball that hard, it the consequentialist calculus doesn't work out. It overall wasn't worth it to go if we were going to do it the way we did it. But Korea, I think, from kind of the throughout the whole process, was a justified outcome, justified intervention. Um, yeah, so I'd back that one.
Yeah, I mean, definitely disagree on all of those things. But I guess we could go into the war, I'm sure we will. But I think more than even getting your opinion about Korea, I'm kind of more interested to know how you make sense of your worldview in that sense, because to be a libertarian, I mean, as far as I remember, I went through a bit of a libertarian phase, when I was in my early 20s.
Everyone says that.
And yeah, yeah. And well, and that was, I'm a little older than you, I take it. I'm in my early 30s. And when I guess it was about 2010, so the first Obama term, and it was just very clear that Obama was, this by and large disappointment in every conceivable way, based on all of the, momentum he had politically, and we expected a lot more, right? And I kind of looked at it like, okay, the government really just doesn't work, and it sucks. And this whole idea of like this Ron Paul movement where we need less government, more freedom for people, let us take care of ourselves, made a lot of sense to me. But Ron Paul, one of the big appeals to me was that he was so consistently anti-war. The Iraq War was like a huge deciding political turning point in my life, right? Like that happened when I was very young, and I remember so clearly seeing that it wasn't justified, as you mentioned. And I didn't understand why we were over there. Didn't understand why we were blowing up cities. Our men were dying. It was costing all this money. Um, so, but okay, I generally find most libertarians align with me pretty well on the anti-war stuff, simply because to have a global war machine of that scale in which you can intervene in another country, you know, miles and miles and miles away with a full military or near full military deployment, such as in the case of Vietnam, at least full enough deployment that it demanded a draft. Doesn't that also necessitate a huge state to bolster such a large military industrial complex?
100% it does. And and I'm not going to disagree with you that I think it's overdone. There's a little bit too much bloat and a little bit too many U.S. military bases. But um, let's go. I mean, uh, for me, it's just a calculation problem. It's not like a principle issue because and we can go back to our first principles here of we both agree that invading Nazi Germany was correct. I'll even go further. Even if Nazi Germany wasn't invading other countries around it, but was just doing the Holocaust within its own borders, I still think it would have been justified to invade in order to protect the people that were living there, in order to protect the people from being, herded into camps and killed. I also think the Civil War was justified. Again, a Union war machine rolling into the South, destroying immense amounts of infrastructure, fifth bloodiest war in world history. But I mean, what was the goal and what was the outcome? The goal was to liberate millions of people from slavery, and the outcome was that millions of people got liberated from slavery. So, again, both of those interventions required a tremendous amount of expense, required a state, required intervention, um, and so this is where I think I depart from a lot of classical libertarians here, in that they tend to approach this more from a deontological point of view of war is wrong, right? Killing people is wrong, so you shouldn't do it. But I also take the principle of like your own actions are dependent on the context of the situation around you. So if we boiling it down to the micro level, if I look out my window and I see my neighbor being robbed at gunpoint, I think I'm perfectly within my rights to pull out my own gun, go out there and protect my neighbor, right? Get the fuck off of his lawn, stop trying to rob him, leave, otherwise I'll shoot you. That makes sense to me, right? Being able to use force to defend the innocent and defend people. And so, how I approach this and every problem is sort of this kind of consent consequentialism, which is I don't like it when people hurt other people and when people infract upon other people. And so, with every action, what's the best action I can do to minimize the amount of people that are being infracted upon and to minimize the level of infraction that's being levied on them. So, in terms of a genocide, we have a lot of people and we have a whole bunch of infraction. They're being killed on a mass level. This justifies a very high level of intervention, which is war, right? We could go out with our guns and stop them. Now, if it's not a lot of let's say it's not a lot of infraction upon not a lot of people, or let's say one person was unjustly imprisoned in some other country, I'm not sure that would justify a war because I'm recognizing the cost of war when I'm making that calculation. So I'm not against any war. I'm just against war that doesn't make sense, right? If the math doesn't work out, then I say no war. If the math works out, then I do say war. So, I mean, and this is the final thing I'll say, and this is more of a question, or something for you to, I guess, respond to. For me, if tomorrow I could invade Iran without any casualties, I would do it. I think I'd be morally obligated to do it, to invade them and change their country's government to one that respects individual rights more. Would you, if there was no casualties, would you agree with that? Should we just roll in and change the government of Iran?
Uh, would I support invading Iran if there were no casualties?
Yeah.
I don't know. So this kind of goes into an issue I had with you on the panel, I think. But okay, let me just answer your question. If we could magically intervene in other countries and nobody gets hurt in the process, nobody's rights are being trampled, and in the process of us invading, there's no power vacuum resulting in it, there's no death, killing, destruction that's ancillary to the actual problem that maybe exacerbates the problem itself or creates other problems. If all, in other words, if it's everything bad from war is removed from war, am I pro-war? um I mean, yeah, in some magic land, for sure. But okay, in reality, where all of that stuff applies, would I support invading Iran to try and, instill some sort of equitable treatment for women by force? No, I would not support that whatsoever. In
Sure.
fact, I'm firmly, firmly against that.
And I think this highlights my point, though. So if there was none of the negative externalities from war, you would agree. Now, if one person died, just one person, then would you consider invading Iran and liberating all the women there? And if you say yes, I'll give you a chance to answer. Then the next question will be two, and the next question will be three, and then four, and then five, and eventually we will come to some number in which you say, okay, the math doesn't work out anymore, and that's for me as well, right? We will come to some number in which the number of people being killed is just too high, but there is a lot of numbers below that I would accept, right? And I assume you would as well.
Probably not. Because for me, it's not really about body counts here. This isn't necessarily some sort of contest of like, how do we minimize the amount of people who die? I mean, the fact is, like, we intervened in Iran in the 1950s, and we helped, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi come to power. He was a CIA-backed leader, and essentially that created the revolutionary momentum of the Khomeini movement, which is sort of what resulted in this, religious autocracy in Iran today. And I guess my point in bringing that up is to say, us intervening, yes, of course, all of the, horrible destruction and physical brutality wreaked on the people is bad, and it's something that I would like to avoid at all costs. But interventions come with, as you call them, externalities, which I don't think it's possible. In fact, I know for a fact it's not possible to remove those. It's never a clean operation. Um, and we can point to many different examples throughout the world where this has been consistently true, not just with America, but with any quote global power attempting to extend its, tentacles. So I think no. I mean, for me, the idea that we need to impress our values on a different people with their own values, however abhorrent we may regard them, is wrong. Now, at the same time, there is obviously a limit to that. And for me, the limit to, in terms of like what I'm willing to accept without an intervention, I would actually agree with you that if, yeah, there were a Holocaust going on or Holocaust like event where there are literal orders being passed down to exterminate entire groups of people, I think that the global community has, an obligation in a sense to intervene if human rights are being offended on such a scale. But Yeah, I just don't. I happen to think those instances are incredibly rare, at least rarer than we'd like to admit when we talk about the justifications for military intervention.
I think then we probably agree then in principle, just not in scale. So because so when I mentioned body count, I agree it's not just body count, but body count is one of the negative externalities that come with war. Right now, there are plenty of other things as well. Right, cultural instability, economic instability, vulnerability to certain influences that we might not want. Right, there's all sorts of different things that can come about when you invade a country. I'm not saying body count. I mean, body count's a bad thing, I think, but there's also plenty of other bad things we can take a look at. But in the same way that I would accept like one person dying for the invasion of Iran, I could accept some minimal levels of other externalities to justify, the invasion of Iran. Because I think what Iran is doing is bad, and there's some level that I would say, okay, it's like the losses are low enough, we can go in. But if they're doing something worse, because I don't think Iran is doing something as bad as Nazi Germany was doing, right? If they're doing something worse, then the level of negative externalities that I'm willing to accept goes up, right? And as long as the positives outweigh the negatives, then I'm going to go ahead and move forward if possible. So I think what it probably is that why I said we're not really disagreeing in principle is I think you're putting a really heavy weight on the negative externalities, right? You think they're very, very morally heavy, and then you're not putting as much weight on the positives of, government change or regime change or liberation, depending whatever uh, loaded phrase that people use to justify what they do, right? So we both agree that Nazi Germany, okay, the positives clearly outweigh the negatives, but maybe we disagree when I think the Korean War, the positives outweigh the negatives. You might just say, well, the negative externalities of that were just so much more, right? And I agree, there were negative externalities. A lot of people died, and a lot of buildings were destroyed, and there was a lot of instability for a very long time.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fair summary of how my view, in a sense. Look, I tend to think that history bears out, in my view, the evidence that particularly American geopolitical intervention has reaped very little good and a tremendous amount of bad. And we can point to many different instances. I mean, you kind of made the argument that I was going to make for Korea, but we could move to Vietnam. I mean, just the thousands and thousands of people who were killed, untold amounts more who were, their villages or homes were destroyed. They were horribly injured, both through chemical weapons and other, direct, I guess, traditional military arms. People in neighboring countries who were destroyed, the instability, which ironically led to the rise of the Khmer Rouge, which also received money from the U.S. For a brief time.
Brief.
Which then went and basically led an extermination campaign of their own in Cambodia. Um, I mean, like, geez, East Timor, Afghanistan. Afghanistan was a 20-year war to remove a regime from power, which came back to power within a couple weeks completely of us leaving the country, $2 trillion poorer, with uh, hundreds, if not at least in the low thousands, Americans dead, and hundreds of thousands of Afghanis dead, or at least in the tens of thousands. I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but lots of Afghanis dead. You know, Iraq and the instability there and the formation of ISIS. You mentioned Libya before. I mean, we go down the list. I would even argue, and this might be a sort of controversial take, that the NATO intervention in the Balkans has, I wouldn't say the instability there is anywhere near the levels of the other places I mentioned, although I think Vietnam has kind of recovered. Indochina broadly has recovered fairly well from that. But yeah, I mean, the Balkans still, I mean, if you look at the tensions, Kosovo, Serbia today, that's a very, it feels like a touch and go kind of situation, and could foment into a all out war between Kosovo and Serbia. So I just don't see a whole lot of benefits from any of our interventions. I totally understand the mentality of, hey, what about the greater good? Like, how can we ensure, the most amount of good and the least amount of bad? And in theory, like, okay, well, if we remove this harmful regime, or undermine their power in a way, in such a manner that they're totally delegitimized, then we can establish some universal, well, because liberalism is universal, and we can establish some sort of government which rules based on these liberal values that we know and love, and Enlightenment era, John Locke, Montesquieu, whatever, and the people and democracy, blah blah blah. And like that just never ends up bearing out in reality. I think that whether we like to admit it or not, a lot of our ideals, liberal ideals, don't always apply perfectly to other parts of the world and other cultures. I think people, there's certainly some compatibility there in some cases, but I don't think it's a universally applicable system of ethics, or beliefs or moral precepts.
So you named a couple interventions that I would agree. I didn't think the math worked out. I don't think Afghanistan worked out. I don't think Iraq worked out. Those are the two big ones in the recent, you know, 20 years. Um, I disagree with you strongly on Kosovo. I think my understanding is the NATO intervention there stopped a genocide, and prevented a lot of serious harm from occurring, and brought a lot of stability to an otherwise collapsing area. Um, so I think that one was good. I think Korea was good. If we want to go back to World War II, obviously, Japan and Germany are examples of massive countries in which the U.S. put a tremendous amount of effort into shifting the culture away from kind of the problematic tendencies that they had before into the top economic power, some of the top economic power players in the whole world. Taiwan is another example where not directly a war, but U.S. military spending and U.S. military intervention, and putting our troops there, and sailing the Sixth Naval Fleet through the strait every once in a while, is keeping that country alive and preventing that country from being overrun and ultimately destroyed. And when you look at Taiwan compared to China, I don't think there's a comparison in terms of the benefit and the well-being of the people there and the liberties that every individual citizen there enjoys. Vietnam, this is the one that I controversially somewhat defend. Again, ultimately, we weren't successful, which is what I think makes it wrong, because there was the cost without the benefit. But of course, hindsight's 2020, right? Whenever you're going to war, you're making a prediction. Nothing is ever guaranteed. But that's the same case with every kind of self-defense or defense of other person's case, right? If my neighbor's getting robbed, I can't guarantee that I can defend him, but I'm gonna sure as hell try. Um, I think if Vietnam was successful, you would have saw a repeat of what happened in Korea. I think, you look at the stats under U.S. Occupation, South Vietnam, um, their GDP, quality of living, all the standard socioeconomic measurements skyrocketed, and then immediately upon the NVA occupation, you saw a mass economic collapse. Um, Most of the industrialization and westernization was rolled back. Obviously, the same thing we're seeing in Afghanistan. Um, and a lot of people lost their liberties. A lot of people lost. Now, not to say the South Vietnamese government was all that libertarian. There was obviously problems, but of course, the South Korean government was also not all that libertarian. But I mean, now it sort of is. Maybe not as much as I'd like it to be, but definitely compared to the North, there's more of a respect for individual rights and more of a market liberalism. So, you know, we can go back and forth and point to different countries where we think it was justified, where it's not. Again, I think we agree on the basic principle. We just maybe disagree as to how efficacious the U.S. has been in its application of this principle. And we're probably going to find a lot of agreements. We're probably going to find some disagreements. But I wanted to ask you, maybe branching out a little bit, you mentioned that you don't think these liberal values of democracy or I don't think you said it, but I would consider a liberal value to be individual liberty and individual rights. You don't think that they're compatible with certain areas, um, And being a Marxist Leninist, my understanding of that government structure is that democracy and individual rights are not particularly championed. Is that accurate? And how do you view your brand of Marxist Leninism if you were going to apply it on some kind of grander scale?
No, I look, that's a fair question because I think a lot of communists, um, we talked about this before with dogmatism. Communists tend to struggle, first of all, acknowledging, I think, the inconsistencies with the doctrine and the places and peoples who where it is applied or applied by. And I think socialism with Chinese characteristics is a really good example, in my view, of how uh, governments that purport to be Marxist Leninist governments, they're guided by the principles of communism. They have their own agenda and their own view on how to implement this system. And the Chinese model, of course, is very controversial, not just among communists, but among anybody with political interest, as to what extent you can even call it communist. And a lot of people will say, well, it's not the perfectly state-run, economy. Like there's still market liberalization, there's still special economic zones, there's still, inequality between worker and factory owner and or capitalist. There's still profits, there's still commodities, whatever. But I think that, to be a mature, real adult and still be a communist, you have to acknowledge the fact that we're never going to reach the classless, stateless society written about in our lifetime, realistically. It's just not an attainable goal, at least at the current level of development of our forces of production. Um, so for me, I would say that, yeah, like, okay, to your point, there are aspects of Marxist-Leninist doctrine, if we're dogmatic enough, that don't apply to every people in every situation. So then how can I subscribe to that, and what do I define it as? Well, I'm an American, so I look at the American context. And for me, Marxism Leninism advocates for, basically a both legal and illegal political action for the means of establishing a more equitable government in which the workers or working class people, broadly speaking, and in America, that the way we define that is very different than how it's been defined through history, in my view. But working people, broadly speaking, will be the true inheritors of power, and they will be able to properly orient the forces of production such that we can, uh, you know, basically accelerate our already exponential growth and advance towards an economic foundation in which all people's basic needs can be taken care of. And I know a lot of that is vague in general, right? But I think that, like, I guess what I'm trying to say with that definition is I have no delusions to the idea that, like, well, we're going to have a literal 1917 Bolshevik revolution in America, and we're going to literally shoot, whoever's in power and their families outside of the Winter Palace, outside of the White House, and we're literally going to do Stalinist collectivization. We're literally going to do the Great Leap Forward because Mao did it. Like, I don't believe any of that stuff. I think that America has discrete needs that are distinct to this time and place. And I do think that a more command-oriented economy is at least part of the solution to our problems. And the only way to do that is through undermining the current system, which is just fundamentally broken. I don't know if you and I agree on that or not. It sounds like you're not as maybe radical as I thought, but yeah, the system right now is just so resistant to change that it's hopeless. And to me, communism is basically like you have two choices. If you're honest about the political system, you can either be black pilled and accept the fact that it doesn't work, or you can become a socialist and acknowledge that we have to move past this current system onto something better.
For in terms of like right now, um, like policy positions right now that you would support be done in America, how would you distinguish yourself from like your standard DSA socialist or a social democrat? I mean, what would be like the primary distinct, or maybe not the primary, but a couple like distinguishing factors between what you're advocating for right now in America and what they're advocating for right now and for America?
Okay, it's actually interesting because the DSA, if you look at the DSA's like party platform, essentially, like you look at their fundamental axioms and their uh, specific policy agenda points, there's a considerable amount of agreement I have with a lot of the things they espouse. Like they're real. I can't look at their program and say, "Wow, I objectively think Medicare for all would be a terrible idea." Like I don't. I actually agree with that. Or like a big part of their problem is an anti-imperialist component of foreign policy, such that we shut down the 800 plus military bases we have around the world, greatly reduce defense spending. I'm for all of that. Where I depart from the DSA is the idea that basically democratic socialism essentially has the view that we can reform ourselves out of capitalism. In other words, through gradual reformism and polite and I would say conciliatory action in our current political system, we can just through gradualism get rid of capitalism and all of its antagonisms and problems. In my view, I really don't think that that's possible, and I think history bears that out. You saw, I wouldn't say it was exactly socialism, but you saw a tremendous amount of, economically progressive legislation pass between the Roosevelt administration and the Nixon administration. And then it all kind of fell apart, and there was a radical shift in the other direction, starting under, I would say, really Gerald Ford, but Jimmy Carter, especially with the economic decline, and then the Reagan Revolution, neoliberalism, blah blah blah. So, in my view, the DSA people fail to understand that capitalism as an economic system is like an unconscious process or subconscious process, such that the more it stays around and it isn't, fought tooth and nail in some form or fashion. In other words, communists should have the goal of dismantling that system, in a legitimate way, like pulling out the underpinnings, which I guess keep it propped up, right? More or less.
What does
Um,
that mean specifically?
well, okay, so like I should probably point to exact policy, right? Because that's really was your question. So I think nationalizing our natural resources would be one place that the DSA in their program, I don't know if they explicitly mentioned that, but I would imagine it's not far off from their platform, right? But what a communist or Marxist Leninist would argue is that we would have to have control over the government such that we could basically do that by fiat, right? Like, whether it's through the executive branch or not, like, there would have to be enough worker control over the government that we could, by force, just decide, hey, we're going to nationalize all of America's coal, we're going to nationalize all of America's oil production, and just basically by force take all of that back from private producers. Um, and so the DSA would probably argue, well, we can reach that through reform. We just have to elect these progressive people into Congress, and then they'll slowly shift the party to the left, and then that's how you end up with AOC, who essentially does nothing. She just goes and like makes Instagram videos, and nothing gets done. Um, so yeah, I mean, I would say that communists, through legal and illegal political action, feel like workers would have to directly take control of the government, such that we can, more or less steer the ship unimpeded.
Okay, so I'm just there's a couple things being said. I just want to that seem a little bit contradictory. I just want to converge them maybe a little bit. So you begin, I think, by saying things that I fully agree with, which is uh, this, classless, moneyless society. This isn't happening during our lifetimes, and thank God, right? Well, at least from my perspective, maybe not from yours. But um, when it comes to the actual like policy positions here of like nationalizing natural resources, um, I do think the DSA argues for that in terms of a kind of gradualism, but you also just kind of said you're against gradualism. So, I mean, is what you're advocating for sort of a broader, like a new American Revolution of some sort, in which like Bolsheviks or like communist, Marxist Leninists take control of the government and forcibly implement these policies, such as nationalizing the coal and oil production. And if that is the case, what would the government look like that would be set up by these Bolsheviks? Would it be modeled based on the Soviets, or would it be different?
Yeah, so in terms of the first part of the question, how would this all, play out? And I keep saying legal and illegal action, and I'm just full disclosure, I'm a little limited to what I can really advocate
Oh,
for on a
sure.
stream. You know
Gotcha,
what I'm
gotcha,
saying?
gotcha, gotcha, gotcha.
And to be honest, just to be quite frank, I'm for any, sort of major upheaval that results in the least amount of violence possible, preferably none. But I also, listen, I'm a student of history. I understand, I look at our system like it's so fundamentally broken that it's actually trending towards collapse, whether we want it to or not. And that violence as a result of that is kind of an inevitability. Um, so, in my view, I think there needs to be well, armed revolutionaries for sure to try and forward our agenda in what I think will be this, descent into chaos. And I know that that sounds pretty dramatic and all that, but that happens to just be my view. I think that, our time as an empire is limited. And I think that, quite honestly, communists are not the only group, you know, hypothetically preparing for that kind of scenario, right? Um, so yeah, I think, when I talk about legal and illegal action, I don't mean like go shoot, the lady down the street for the revolution, or anything retarded like that, but I think that we have to be prepared to actively resist the government by force in the event that they try to undermine our political agenda. Um, and then I also think that we can work within the system to the extent that the system allows us to. Obviously, local elections, and I'm a member of CPUSA. I'm a member of the Communist Party. And I would like to see the party grow such that we can advocate or even run candidates locally and build from there, because we need some semblance of political legitimacy, even in some shit hits the fan scenario. Where we are in America right now, communism is, near universally reviled. And, or, we're considered so fringe and marginal that we have basically just no viability. So we need to fix that. I'm trying to actively work in the party to do that now, and also prepare for the events that we will be actively resisted by the people in power and other groups who want to ascertain power. And then I know it's a long answer, but I'll try to get to the second part of your question quickly. In terms of how we would implement that stuff and all of that, again, I talk about doing things by fiat. I actually think that the way the government operates currently, there's a ton of power vested in the executive branch. I think that's a problem most libertarians have with the way the government is structured. Um, there are tools in place, of course, to check the executive, right? And you saw that with the student loan, legislation from Biden. But I think that, in my dream scenario, right, where we've taken enough power over the government that we can essentially declare legislation by fiat, I think a lot of that would just have to come through executive order. And, that might mean overriding, even if it's an unprincipled style overriding of the other institutions of government that might prevent that from happening. And I think, again, history bears out there are presidents, Roosevelt, who through executive orders and executive action can make massive fundamental changes to the way the government operates in a very short amount of time. Um, so I do think it's possible to do that through government, but again, I think a lot of this is like what I would like to see happen and then what I realistically think will happen. And with the realistic part, I think the shit hits the fan scenario is the most likely. And I just hope communists have enough political clout in that environment to have the support of the people such that we can decide what we want to do with the government. Yeah.
Do you see that happening? Because and look, I vote for a party that never wins too. Don't worry, I know the feels. But I'd be skeptical because like let's be honest here for a second. When you look at both sides of the political aisle that exists in the United States, at least, one side's a little bit more heavily armed than the other, right? And especially when we're talking about the side that, uh, not only the side, but I guess the institutions that have control of the largest military on the face of the planet. So when you say like this is like a more realistic situation, than I guess the subtle sort of like progressive, you know, baby steps kind of thing. Um, I guess I would just say that, you know, I'm skeptical, even from just like a pragmatic point of view, not even addressing the ethics of it, because obviously I think the ethics are problematic in their own way. But even just looking at the pragmatics of it, right? Um, are you going to convince a whole bunch of people in the next several decades, or what's I don't know. Do you see it as feasible within the next century, or is this something that's further out than that?
I was just gonna do law of attraction manifested into reality personally. No, I'm fucking yeah, dude. So I think okay. I actually completely understand what you mean. And to be quite honest, let's say shit hit the fan next month. The communists are fucked. Like there's, one communist for every 100,000 conservatives. You know what I mean? And 100,000 liberal Democrats. Um, so I don't see a scenario now where the communists have any chance to take power. And I think that's why I'm trying to operate with a degree of urgency in my political work, in my day to day life. I try hard within my own party to try and make outreach to the community and just to educate them on who we are, what we're about, and try to understand what the community needs. And then, that's one community. But CPUSA in general, it's such an important moment in history for this party because they really have an opportunity in their hands, and I don't even think they realize it, to take advantage of what I think is a obvious, just undeniable mass populist momentum in the country. But I would also say a populist momentum with some left-wing economic leanings. And I think the Bernie Sanders movement demonstrated that a lot of those ideas, policy prescriptions, etc., have, are tremendously popular, to say the least. But we're up against a lot, as you mentioned, I think, or alluded to anyway. Anti-communism and anti-communist propaganda has been a major, I mean, I'm a history teacher. I teach high school. I have to teach at times what I consider to be literal anti-communist propaganda to kids because it's on their state exams. And, we're up against a lot. But hey, I mean, I wouldn't be active politically if I didn't think that, first of all, people's reliance on institutional knowledge and faith in institutions and traditional views of the world was breaking down. I think that's objectively happening. And then B, also think that it's possible to win people over. I think that's how all political movements start, with the idea that you can work with regular people and win them over. Um, so yeah, I mean, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm wrong, and we all get mowed down by like a bunch of fucking like Trumpers or something. It's possible. I don't know, but um, I'm going to try to fight the good fight. Yeah.
So you are the teachers. You're one of the teachers that DeSantis warned me about, right? One of these commie CRT pushing. No, okay. Um, all right. So winning over hearts and minds. Now we're kind of talking about a political process that to me seems a little bit more like gradualism, right? Like slowly trying to build up power. You get people involved that have your position, more as much as possible. Get more people to vote. Get more people to get involved. Great. I think that's. I mean, not great because I disagree with almost everything that you'd push, but great in terms of this is more of a political process as opposed to um, what I find very often with a lot of people, which is LARPing. Now, natural gas, coal, oil, that stuff naturalized or nationalized, sorry. Um, let's just say you and your irk gain a whole bunch of power. You take over the executive. The Supreme Court tries to stop you, but you just FDR them and say fuck you. We're gonna do what we want to do, right? Um, Post this, can I start my own company? Could I go and build a building and start within the building manufacture computers and then sell those computers to people for money and keep the profit? Is that something that you'd let me do?
Yeah, and listen, this might sound like a cop out, but this is honestly my belief. Some markets need to still exist. We are not going to create, again, some perfectly equitable system in which everybody gets a smartphone magically and the government makes all the smartphones. I don't think that that's realistic. And maybe smartphones and technology is only one example of what I mean by this. I actually think America's small businesses have been kind of crushed under capitalism, ironically. And you might disagree with that. I know a lot of libertarians feel like, well, this is just because of the state's interference in the economy that's allowed monopolies to exist, and that's crushed small businesses, and that is true. I'm not denying that, but I would also argue that that state intervention is the result of capitalism and capitalists having a vested interest in taking control of the political system. But okay, like without getting too deep off topic, I think that yeah, like having a thriving small business segment of the economy is totally fine. I don't think that that would interfere with my vision for what America needs, and I actually would argue it's fundamental to maintaining power here. Americans are incredible, like that. Those liberal values we talked about, classical liberal values, they're probably most popular in this country, and you're not going to force people to depart from that stuff just because you come to power. That's how you get an active resistance to your party. Um, so I'm definitely pro gun rights. Is another thing. Like I think people need to be able to protect themselves, um, and I think that trying to take people's guns away is the probably one of the fastest routes to pissing people off and losing political legitimacy. But yeah, to answer your question, I think some level of private business ownership would be totally fine. It's something that I think in the long run I'd like to see us trend away from, because I think through automation we can get to a point where most people can have almost all their needs, if not all of them, met. But we're not at that stage now. We're at a stage of production now where I think the government should take full control of certain industries, provide people with basic needs, housing, food, healthcare, education. And then from there, we need to also give the government the freedom to orient production to a certain extent, rebuild America's infrastructure. But yeah, some level of business ownership will have to exist for a lot of reasons.
Look, I knew you were pro gun before I even talked to you. That is one thing. We are talking about before about how there's some overlaps between libertarians and Marxist Leninists. That tends to be the most consistent one that I've noticed, which is that you guys are pretty good on the gun. I mean, look, I just finished cleaning 3 of mine. I think that it's a great hobby. Highly recommended if anybody wants to nerd out over firearms. Just shoot me a message. I would love to do so.
Based.
Um, Now, interesting. We're okay. So we're okay with some markets. So let's go back to the hypothetical where I'm in my building computers, and I'm building computers, constantly. And somebody comes up to me and they say, "Look, I want to learn to build computers like you. Okay, I can't build computers as well as you can. Um, can I build computers with you?" And then you look at them and you say, "Well, people trust the computers that I make, right? They know that I make them good, and I don't really trust you going off and building computers and slapping my name on it. So if you want to learn to build computers the way I do, you got to stay here and do it the way I want you to, okay? Because that's what the customers want. And also training you and teaching you to build these computers is going to take me time. It's going to cost me money, and so it doesn't seem fair to me. And you're also going to be using, my equipment that I worked, the last 20 years to buy, and you're going to be, you're basically walking into something that I've been building. And so, in order to do that, I'm going to let you do it, but I'm going to get a percentage of every computer that you sell. Now, is this something that you'd allow me to do?
Yeah, I think private markets come with all the features of private markets. So if that means you owning the means of production and someone working for you, well, that is what it means. Then yeah, we would have to tolerate that to a certain level. We can't insist upon everything be like this was my issue, and I didn't really get to address it with Valmet, partially because we're on the same team. With this idea of like, okay, everything has to be workers' co-ops. Now, I think the co op model is preferable in many ways to the traditional business model, just in terms of like having a more equitable workplace where exploitation is less than, a top down sort of thing. But, listen, Marxist Leninists, the one thing that we're very honest about is that we, acknowledge the need for central control, right? Anarchists, Orthodox Marxists, even some Trotskyists, they don't really acknowledge that need. And I think that centralized control, be it the government or even in the workplace, uh, it has to exist to some extent. You need someone to guide how production will take place. And ideally, it'll be somebody who's an expert in that particular venture, whatever it is. So, yeah, I mean, to answer your question, I think if we have some level of private markets, I don't philosophically disagree with what you're suggesting. And I also happen to think it's something that might need to exist in order for markets to exist at all. There needs to be somebody who owns the business, there needs to be people who work there. I actually also think in my system where we're trying to take care of people's primary needs, the level of exploitation of workers, whether or not it's, I would argue it's reduced significantly by the state being able to provide those things to people. What you have now is people working who can't meet those needs on their own or struggle to. And, that's where the exploitation is felt the most. Is literally, a lot of your money going just to be able to get by, living paycheck to paycheck, and so forth. So yeah, I mean, long answer, but yeah, I hope I addressed your question.
Yeah, well, you gave rise to one more question. I'm hearing a lot of pro market stuff, which always makes me happy. But the one thing you did say was that there needs to be some kind of centralized guidance. Now, if I go to my own building and I say I'm going to build a computer, that's my life's work, and we're building a fuck ton of computers, and then we got, let's say, I get the process of I bring on the person who is going to work for me and make computers, and then I bring on another person, and then I got like 5 people doing this. Um, how are you going to centrally guide me in what I'm doing? Because like I said, I just went over to my own building and I want to push out computers, and the people want them. That's why they're giving me money for them. Is this industry going to be something that's centrally directed and controlled at all, or is it going to be just the industries that you are sort of defining as like a need, such as housing, food, healthcare, stuff like that, or would it be computers as well?
Right. So okay, yeah, it's a good question. And just to clarify, when I talk about central control, I guess I'm speaking really philosophically, right? The idea that there needs to be somebody in charge, be it the government or in the workplace. But Yeah, in terms of the government's control over the workplace. I do think that industries that employ, industries, right? In this case, the building of computers that employ, hundreds of thousands of people, probably more than that, right? Altogether. I don't know. Again, I don't have any figures in front of me. I'm just fucking spitballing. But industries of that size and magnitude would need a substantial amount of government oversight. And I believe that's not, yes, it's partially to, I guess, in a sense, ensure there isn't abuse of workers happening, but we already have that, right? We already have OSHA. We already have regulations in place that prevent companies from exploiting workers too much. But I think the government and bureaucrats within the government could be involved in production in a sense that they could guide these industries in terms of how much they should produce and what their quotas should be and so forth. Um, with significant input from the people who run the company itself. And I actually like the Chinese model, which is essentially certain companies or companies of a certain size, be they state owned outright or not, they have party members on the board of directors. So there's like government input into the decisions being made. And I think that that's essential in the system that I'm describing, that there needs to be some sort of oversight. And then there also needs to be collaboration, right, with the people who work in that industry who really know what they're doing. That's why I really don't agree with socialists who think like, oh, the government could just start making fucking, Nintendo Switches tomorrow and it would be fine. Like I don't know if it would be fine. You'd have to work with people who work at Nintendo now and collaboratively, produce Nintendos. So I hope that makes sense. But yeah.
Yeah, like, wouldn't it make more sense to have, like, again, if I bought the building and I'm bringing on workers, to allow the person who owns the company to decide who the board of directors is, or put people in the board of, like, having the board of directors be made up of the people most competent in that industry, as opposed to the government? Like, why do we have to get the state involved when we want the market to just simply be responding based on market demand, right? I mean, ideally, this would be building computers based on how many people want computers, not based on what some government official thinks the people deserve in terms of computers. Um, I guess that would be my contention here. Like, what's the benefit here of throwing on just some bureaucrat instead of having it either be decided by the person who owns it, which I guess would be like the individual rights perspective, but even in terms of efficiency, just have, like, even if they're all private sector, just the smartest people.
Yeah, and so my view on that is again, it depends what your goal is in terms of producing stuff. And I think that that's really the basis of socialism is the idea that we can produce things in a manner that we reduce the social problems that result from capitalism. And what are those social problems? Well, poverty. And what is poverty? Poverty is the lack of needed resources and commodities in order to have a sustainable life, right? Um, and so I think in the case of production of, say, computers, even, or really anything, the government being involved and helping with, determining the rate at which things should be produced is because the goal of these companies should not be simply to generate profit, but it should be to produce enough so that everybody has enough of what they need. In this case, computers, it's hard to quantify like how much each person needs a computer, but I think we all agree that society is better off in one in which everybody at least has access to a computer. So we could orient production in that manner. Ensuring that enough citizens we produce enough of these computers or these computer parts or necessary, widgets associated with the computer or whatever the fuck, such that it's available to every citizen. And yeah, I think that that's the whole benefit of having the government involved. In the case of China, they're in a weird position in a way, or a weirder position than us. We're in a different position than them because the government being involved is more about how trying to figure out the best way to orient these companies to compete internationally so that to the benefit of the overall Chinese economy and to try and sustain growth, maintain growth, and accelerate growth where possible. America is in a different position. I mean, we're already number one. I think that we want to continue growing, and that I don't want to decelerate growth, but I think having the government involved could both orient production in a way that is hopefully uh, uh, I would say motivates more growth or continued growth, and could also produce things to such an extent that the availability of these commodities are more ubiquitous.
Okay. I One of the issues I'm having is a lot of the disagreements I have with you are going to just be empirical, right? Like, I don't think that putting on bureaucrats onto a company board is going to make the company work better. I think it's from even like a purely pragmatic point of view. I think it's going to not be good, especially in the current system, which is corporations have a duty, have a fiduciary duty to their shareholders in order to be as profitable as possible. And in order as a computer company to make profit, you try to create and sell the most efficient computers possible. Now, um, but I'm not even sure that like I'm obsessed here when it comes to putting people on the board that are maximally efficient or maximally intelligent. I think the main problem I have with what you're proposing, as I think I would have with almost everything you would propose, except for the gun rights, which are based, would be that they require a significant element of authoritarianism. They require a significant element of people interfering into my shit, right? So when I go and kind of go talking a little bit about first principles here, um, libertarians generally believe in the Lockean principle of, you know, you have a right to your body. That's the foundational right that you have. I have a right to my life. And so when I go out and I spend my time and my labor and as a, and work, really, I think it's actually a pro worker ideology. When you spend your work building some kind of product, right? Last time it was a chair, we can change it to an anvil or a gun or whatever, right? When you build it, you have a right to this thing that you've just created because you built it, right? And if I decide to give that to my son or my grandfather or anybody, then they have a right to it. And the reason they have a right to it is because one of the principles of property is that just like with your time and your labor and your body, you can choose to give it away and you can choose to give it to who you want to give it to. So if I want to choose to give whatever I made to my grandfather, um, I should have the right to transfer that property, transfer part of my life and my time away. And if somebody tries to take it from him, the reason why it's wrong is because they're taking away the time and the labor that he has a right to, because ultimately I gave it to him. And if I don't have the right to give it to him, then I have no rights over it at all. Now, when we're talking about the government coming in and controlling the mode of production, directing people what to do, putting bureaucrats on the boards of these corporations, dictating uh, production quotas for computers, what essentially is happening is either you are telling workers what to do when you're commanding workers what to do, or you're commanding owners what to do. And owners are simply people who are in possession of work that was done before. So ultimately, I think you're alienating people from their work, right? And and this is why I was questioning, like, when we look at this concept of need, um, does anybody deserve the work that somebody else has, the labor that somebody else has, just because they happen to exist? Right? Why is it that every time, or just naturally, in order to enforce this, you need to have authoritarian intervention and authoritarian processes, which I think you see with China. I mean, are you concerned at all about authoritarianism? Are you concerned about what I would say is robbing people of their work and controlling people's work and controlling people's lives? Do you see it that way? Do you think I'm totally off base? I mean, on the Lockean philosophy, and and are you concerned with authoritarianism because as a self-described libertarian, that's what I'm most concerned about. I hate authoritarianism. I hate people trying to tell me what to do and control my life.
Yeah. Well, there's a bunch of ways I could go with this, but I think the most direct is to say that obviously I'm more comfortable with authoritarianism than you and probably the average American. And I happen to think that one disagreement I have with liberals a lot is and you would probably agree with me on, is that most systems of government are authoritarian. In fact, all of them are by their very nature. In order to operate in any way, you need to be able to, by force, give the government, or the government has to have enough power that by force it can orient, the economic production of, say, tanks and bombs and shit, and go and jump into armed conflict in Korea, as you mentioned before, as being an example of something you would support. That entails some degree of authoritarianism. You need to be able to take control, or at least, assume some degree of control over production and people to, make that happen. So I think I'm more pragmatic with the authoritarian thing than a lot of people are. But I also think, yeah, maybe I'm more comfortable with the idea that we need a system which can, respond to our needs immediately. I mean, that's the whole point of governments, is like they should exist to meet our needs and not fail to do so because of delays and prevarications in Congress that really, come down to this attitude of intransigence that's rooted in the system's inability to correct itself at the risk of undermining itself. And I know that's a little word salady, but quite simply, I think that we have to kind of move past this radical American adherence to, you know, I'm entitled to this and I'm entitled to that, and I'm a sovereign individual. Like, the reality is, whether we wish to acknowledge it or not, you're not as sovereign as you think. And this goes into your example about choosing who you give your labor to. In a perfect vacuum, your example is actually pretty easy to understand. You build something and you need something, so you go and trade for it, or you want to trade for something. But I think that it only works in that, very abstract example, because the reality is, when you go and produce stuff, I mean, let's just ignore the real world and even go a little less abstract than what you're describing. In a world with lots of people in it, you can't possibly produce on your own everything that you would need. So you're forced to go out and trade, right? You have to go and trade for the things that you need that you can't produce on your own, right? Because there's a finite amount of resources, there's a finite amount of time in the day to do things. So when you go out and venture out into the world to trade, you're also limited to the amount of people you can trade with based on where you are, based on what they have, what kind of labor they do. And you are kind of forced into these social relations where you have to give your labor to certain people who have the things that you might need. Um, so I think that that's just the reality of how societies work. And then if you want to go into the world we live in, people grow up now with no opportunity to do independent labor, or very little opportunity to do independent labor and produce stuff. And it's not just because, well, we have this, totally like oppressive system, blah, blah, blah. I mean, maybe in some ways you could argue that, but I don't think we should tear this, modernity down for the sake of being more libertarian. I think, um, in other words, large institutions, be them corporations or the government, or even, mid-sized businesses, they control so many resources that realistically, you're never going to be able to have enough of what you need just on your own, producing for yourself. If you live on a farm in Montana, you still need electricity from someone. You know what I mean? You're going to have to pay the power utility. You're reliant on other people. And, that's sort of how economies work. Everybody's kind of interlinked. Production is interlinked. So, yeah, I think that in that sense, is anyone entitled to someone's work? I don't believe outright anyone is entitled to anything, but I think if people do work, that they should have their needs met, and that actually will enable them to work better.
Okay. A couple things. You have to trade for what you need. So, and this is, I think, we're maybe running up against a wall a little bit because I define all needs as just wants, right? Because wants indicate a preference. There are certain things that you have a preference for. One of the things you might have a preference for that I have a preference for as well is survival. There's some people that don't have a preference for survival. And in that case, if somebody had no real preference for survival, then food would not really be a need to them. But and even absent survival, let's say there's like a southern state where you had no severe weather, housing. Why would that be a need? If you have somebody who's able to survive, or there's people out there that've been there for 20 years without an apartment or without a house. I think when you're defining need here, what you're implicitly stating the need is there's some kind of quality of life that you think people are entitled to, right? There's some minimal kind of line here that you want people to have because people tend to have a commonality in preferring it very strongly. People tend to prefer electricity, even though there was a time before electricity in which people survived, and people wouldn't have never defined electricity as a need because it didn't exist, right? But now it's kind of become ubiquitous. People like it. They like to run their TVs. They like to run their refrigerators. So it's kind of morphed into this quote unquote need. Um, even you know, and so going off of that, I guess when we're talking about this need that I would say are just simply strong preferences. Um, One of the reasons why I am so strongly in favor of the individual right to the things you create, even if you have to trade them for other things that you strongly prefer, even if you have to trade them for things that you strongly prefer to satisfy your preference of continued existence, is because anything alternative to that, I would argue, is slavery, right? If you have to live off somebody else's work, right, from each according to his ability to each according to his need, to me, this would seem like the definition of parasitism, right? You have somebody who, in order to survive, they need something, or in order to continue their preferences and in order to run their TV, they need something. And if they get to have that without somebody agreeing to give it to them, if the other person needs to be forced to give it to them, well, just like let's replace electricity with cotton, right? What if I need cotton for my bed? Do I get to force somebody to give me cotton? And the reason I'm using cotton here, obviously, is because the connotation of, in antebellum South, there were a bunch of people that thought they wanted, or they thought they needed cotton, and they wanted people to give it to them without their consent. This principle of consent, and this is less of a question, more of just me kind of asserting my ideology at this point, because I mean, I understand that I value consent a lot here. Um, I think even if you needed cotton to survive, let's just say cotton was some kind of like food source or something, that would never justify slavery. I would rather the people die than force people to work for them, and to get their quote unquote needs satisfied. Because ultimately, if the only way that you can continue this preference of survival is by living off somebody else, I mean that just feels wrong. Uh, do you kind of see where I'm coming from? Do you see at least why I could say that it feels wrong? What are your thoughts on everything I've just said?
Yeah, I mean, listen, so yeah, okay. I see your logic. I don't think that you're not making sense. But dude, like this requires a tremendous amount of like idealism to try and like significantly more than I think anything I've argued for, which I think I'm pretty pretty idealistic for a communist.
You've
But
been pretty moderate so far. You're the most moderate Marxist-Leninist I've ever met. I'll say that.
well, and remember, look, I started as a centrist, so well, I started as a liberal, and then I became a centrist. So, but okay, but let me address a few of the things you said. Well, actually, let me just ask you a question. I mean, survival is a want. Do you believe any needs even exist?
No, I don't think need is simply a word that we use to define something that we really, really, really want, right? The incels think they need to have sex, but like uh, they don't, right? Because it doesn't matter how much they want it, even if they say they need it. Oh, I need to have sex. You don't get to have sex unless somebody consents to give it to you. I don't care how much you think you need it. Really, you just want it.
Uh-huh. I think I'm kind of like flabbergasted by that a little bit. I mean, I do understand the comparison you're making with the incels and all that, but I would define a need. I mean, we could pull up a dictionary definition, but like, who gives a fuck? I would define a need as something required to have a well, to survive, right? And I think I guess I'm willing to say that yes, I will advocate for what you might consider wants if it means more people will survive. And I can't kind of escape the irony that you're willing to, for example, interfere using the military in other parts of the world to try and create more equitable systems because people need equality or something like that. But you also don't think people need like housing and food and shit. Like those are just things they really want.
Well, I'm simply trying to defend people from coercive actions being like inflicted upon them. It's not about their right, or I guess more, it's not really about their entitlement to anything, right? So, when you can phrase it that way, I suppose, right? When I go out in my front lawn and my neighbor's being threatened by some robber, right? It's not that I guess you could phrase it that my neighbor has like an entitlement to not be fucked with. But in reality, what's happening is this guy is coercing upon my neighbor, right? My neighbor is not saying he's entitled to anything that the robber has or anything that I have or anything that I've made or anything whatsoever. He's not saying that, he gets some right to that. It's just, he has what he has either worked for or contracted for. That's what he has the justified right to. And somebody's trying to come fuck with it, right? Someone's trying to come fuck with him. I'm not. I'm against going to fuck with people. And when you have somebody like let's say electricity for example, you mentioned electricity. Like, do you think I'd be fucking with my neighbor if I didn't give him my electricity, or would that just be me not fucking with him? And let's say the only way he gets electricity is if I give him some of mine. Am I fucking with him by saying no? Sorry, I want all my own electricity.
Okay, I do get the example, but again, I think that these are like kind of like the only way that this stands to reason is in like the radical abstractions. So in terms of electricity, in order to produce electricity, like nobody produces, or very, very few people, I won't say nobody, very few people are capable of producing their own electricity. They just don't have the means through which they can do that. And, I mean, I guess you could argue some of that is like the government monopoly on electric production or whatever. But okay, man, I kind of feel like we're in a much better scenario where we're supposedly through coercion forcing people to pay taxes so we have
Yep.
like electricity or some sort of like infrastructure capable of transmitting electricity such that in your market-based principles people can then pay the power utility and get the power. Now to your point, I think if somebody is not doing anything like and you mentioned parasitism, and that's how I define parasitism, is like somebody who doesn't produce anything but consumes, right? That is a problem, of course, right? And as an ML, I'm actually completely against that. I think that everybody should be required to produce, and, he who does not work shall not eat, right? But I also think that if you're working, you need, in order, first of all, to sustain your own labor, which not only has a benefit to yourself, but a greater social benefit. The more people are producing, the better everybody is off. I mean, you mentioned before business owners and the like, you want like big scale collective production, whether it's a business owner doing it or the government doing it. And so for that to be possible, or at least be as effective as it possibly can be, you need to make sure all those people can have their needs met. And I do define like, dude, housing and food, like, yes, like you need that, literally need it to live. I mean, like, what's the longest you've ever been without food or water? Like I think that it becomes very clear at that point that it's not a want. It's,
Let me
you know,
assume. Let me assume though, that you're advocating for more than just food and water and shelter, right? Because in the U.S. we have food stamps. Nobody starves to death in the U.S. unless there's some kind of administrative error, right? Unless somebody fucks up and doesn't deliver the food or the food stamps where they're supposed to go. In the U.S., I mean, you can look this up. It just doesn't happen. If people get water. The rates of deaths from dehydration often have to do with people with certain medical conditions or mental conditions, not the fact that people can't go to the water fountain and get some water. Um, but for like anything else that maybe even you would describe as like a powerful want, so electricity to run my TV, or a phone, or anything else that most Marxist Leninists would advocate that everybody should have something, right? I think even computers. You said before, like, you know, at some point we want the people to have computers. Now, let's take this principle of we're not talking about like satisfying the desire to survive anymore, but instead we're talking about some kind of luxury or some kind of, well, I want to have it to have fun. Um, I mean, that now to me seems directly comparable to the incel position. I mean, it's economic incelism, right? You're saying I want this and I can't get people to give it to me, so I'm going to assert I have some kind of right to it, even though I can survive without it, right?
right. I think when you phrase it that way, I see what you mean. But okay, I mean, the computer example I used, the argument I'm trying to make is that there's a greater social benefit if all people have access to technology. There's a greater social benefit if all people have access to lots of things, healthcare, education. It could be more general than just owning a computer. I happen to think a computer falls under that because it makes society more interconnected. Information can spread more quickly. Ideas can spread more quickly. Everybody can more easily amplify their voice. Learn. Blah 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 blah. We all agree computers are good. I don't even think capitalists disagree with me on that. It's a matter of how far we're willing to go to try and pursue that end goal. And in my view, I understand where the idea of like, oh, you're entitled to this
Right.
comes from. Like nobody should be entitled to anything, and that's what I'm trying to articulate. Maybe not as clearly as you would like, but or maybe not clear enough. To be fair, I do think the idea that people are just entitled to have shit for nothing. I mean, it's King Lear. Nothing comes from nothing, right? You have to work to the extent that you're able to. I do think that like we should probably take care of like children and the disabled and the elderly. Like I think that there's a greater social benefit. It's the humane thing to do. So, yeah, I think that, but otherwise, people should work. People should definitely work. That's why I think the government can, address the needs of production by orienting our labor force. Because, the markets can only employ so many people. In fact, by their very nature, they function with a level of unemployment by design. And so I think that the government can kind of not only pick up the slack but do a significant more production. But I do want to ask, I mean, and I feel like you didn't address it really, how can you advocate for military intervention into another country because the people are being denied X, Y, or Z civil liberty, and that's justified? You're willing to kill for that, take someone else's life away. I would call that coercion. Um, but you're not willing to acknowledge that people in America need certain basic needs. Well, by definition, right?
So, okay, I'll try again. And I understand what the question is. I believe. So, um, I just I think you're using the word need here, where I'm not particularly thinking about it when it comes to like military intervention. So, going back to like the Nazi invading Nazi Germany example, we invaded Nazi Germany, not because the Jews there had a right to continue to live off of other people or whatever, but because people have a right to not be fucked with, right? Negative rights, positive rights are not consistent with negative rights. So, for example, right, you can phrase or not you can phrase if you accept the principle of positive rights, you can phrase almost anything to be positive right, and then the concept of rights becomes meaningless. So when I say, a Jew has a right to not be gassed, I think we can all agree with that, right? But if the German wants to make the positive rights argument, the German could say, well, I have the right to gas Jews, or I have the right to not, I don't consent to live in a world in which I don't get to do that. Well, you're just now like defining this quote unquote right, which you're using to infringe upon the actual rights of somebody else. So where do those actual rights come from? Well, those actual rights, again, on the very principle, the basis of Lockean principle here of you have a right to your life and you have a right to your body. You have a right to not have those things fucked with by other people, right? Nobody gets to interfere with my autonomy. No one gets to interfere with my body because that's something that I own. I get to control what I own, and I own my body. And so, no, just because you don't get what you want from my body doesn't mean that I'm violating your right. So just because the incel doesn't get the sex that he wants from a woman doesn't mean he's getting a right violated, because that woman has the ownership rights over her body, and just like the incel has the ownership rights over his body, and so an even stronger incel doesn't get the right to violate his body, right? Because no matter how much the incel defines his need for sex as a need and a right or whatever, it's never going to be a need if that need is based on taking away what somebody else has a right to. Now, war. This is why it's a calculation problem, because you're quite literally, like, let's think about it like in utilitarianism phrases. So, like, let's imagine there's like a concept of bad, like the utils, right? And we'll just call it like bad utils. And killing somebody is worth 100 bad utils. And stabbing somebody is worth 50 bad utils if they don't die. My goal for a society is to have the minimal amount of bad utils around the world possible. I want as few bad utils, okay? There is no bad utils that are generated by somebody not getting another person's body, right? Because they have no right to that person's body. They have no right to their work. So there's no bad utils generated. But when you stab somebody, you're generating bad utils because you're infringing upon their body, right? You're infringing upon their bodily autonomy. So if I can go and stop Hitler from killing 6 million people by killing 5 million people, then there's overall less bad utils. And so on the consequentialist analysis, I did a good thing. Does that make sense? I know I've had to use a lot of words to describe it, but stopping a bad thing is not the same thing as enforcing somebody getting somebody else's body or somebody else's work.
Okay. I mean, it's fine that you take as much time as you need, because I've taken a bunch of time. It's totally okay. But okay, look. So okay, all of your examples, again, they make sense when they're completely abstracted from reality. And like, okay, in your case of the utils, the bad utils, good utils, okay, we want to minimize the amount of bad utils in the world. And so X action is justified if it reduces the bad utils
Yeah.
total. Yeah. Right. Okay. Fair enough. But in order to accomplish all of the things that you want to do to minimize the bad utils, you need coercion, you need authority. You need people who have control over vast swaths of people
Yes.
and resources and stuff. And so, but for that to hold, you need coercion.
Yes.
And coercion can be direct or indirect. And I guess it's funny because with the whole needing to work thing, and we both disagree with entitlements, we actually do agree on that fundamentally. Nobody's entitled to anything. But at the same time, I think what you're suggesting, it seems to be, is that for people to get the stuff they need, it's totally on them. And I think just there's really not, that's not the best way that we can, using your formula here, that's not the best way to create a lot of good utils, right? Like the best way to create lots of good utils and very few bad utils, at least in our country within our own borders, is to try and make sure people can produce as much as possible and have sustainable lives at the same time. And I think in that kind of system, we can see massive amounts of growth, massive amounts of resources available for everybody to a point where all of their wants and needs of over time can eventually be met. I mean, that's the whole goal of socialism. Um, so look, with your example with Nazi Germany, I get what you mean in that abstracted, example, but in practice, again, you need a tremendous amount of coercion to be able to accomplish that.
Right.
And I just don't see how you can get around that. I mean, like, let me ask you, is it a need to not be gassed to death? I'm sure you would agree with that, like,
So no, no, no. I wouldn't even phrase it that way. So you're right that we would need some level of coercion to accomplish anything as a government, right? I'm factoring that into the calculation, right? I consider all taxation to be theft, but if we steal some money and like those are okay, so we got bad utils right there. Stealing the money is bad utils, and if we use those bad utils to stop a genocide, buying guns, arming them, sending them over, and stopping the gassing of the Jews, then a greater amount of bad utils has been prevented, right? So I'm not denying that every society needs some minimal level of slavery. It's true. Like taxes are theft and theft is slavery. You need to have some level of theft in order to pay for soldiers to go stop genocides. I get it, right? My principle here is I'm trying to minimize it as much as possible. I want as little slavery in society as we can get away with. This is why I've been described as like a minarchist, right? The minimal state possible and the minimal amount of coercion possible, the minimal amount of bad utils that are being created. I'm not concerned about, people like necessarily, growth or people working, although I just think as a happy accident, capitalism does lead to more production. But that's not my principle, right? Even if it didn't, I would still support it because my goal here is to minimize the amount of bad utils that are being created. So, you might think it's a good thing when somebody gets food from somebody else, but I think it's a bad thing when we force somebody to give something that they own over to somebody else. So unless there's some other part of the calculation that we need to make, um, unless there's some like external factor, we're only getting bad utils giving from forcing people to give other people food, or forcing people to give other people housing, or forcing people to give other people sex, right? Like I think, even if we could we like force women to have sex with incels and it actually statistically made the country happier, let's just say for hypothetical sake it did, like we actually have like a study showing that like America's a happier, more productive place now that we forced the women to fuck the incels, I would still be against it. I don't care if it would increase economic growth and GDP and all that shit. I would be so fucking upset that somebody was having their body or their work or something forcibly stolen from them, alienated from them, and given to somebody just because they wanted it. Just because you want something doesn't mean that you should have it. And I think this is why, and I wanted to say, and I'll let you respond to that. But this is why I actually think Marxist Leninists are the most dangerous of all the left wingers. Okay. And the reason you guys are all so fucking dangerous is because when you said the statement, yeah, we would have to force some people, we would have to force people to work because otherwise people don't work. You're like that statement in of itself makes your system viable, right? It makes it able to actually function because these fucking anarcho communists that are like, yeah, we're all gonna have a commune where we all pick our own jobs and wow, everyone's a poet and everyone's a coffee maker, right? That's not going to work. They're going to collapse. They're going to fail. I'm not worried about them. They're jokes, right? But then you have people who are saying, no, we're going to force people to go mine. We're going to force people to grow food, and we're going to force people to grow cash crops, and we're going to make people do shit. We're going to institute, which is what I believe is essentially grand scale slavery. I have no doubt that could work, and that's what terrifies me. What terrifies me is that the proposed, like, I don't think the axioms are rational, but the means in which you guys are willing to go through to actually make your world a reality is rational, right? It makes sense to a reasonable person. You have a rational brain, and that's so fucking scary. We need all leftists to be insane fuckers who believe in poetry. That's where I want them all to be. I want them all to think, no, we would never make anybody work. We're all just going to sit in a commune, smoke weed, and read poetry. Great. That's what I want them to think. Because holy shit, if they ever get into the brain state of, well, no, we can actually make people to work. Oh my god, that's when we start getting China and Soviet Union and fucking crazy shit. Anyway, I thank you for letting me rant.
No, it's fine, dude. I actually, I could see why you have an audience. You're a smart guy. You're interesting to talk to. So let me say this. First of all, there's no greater compliment that you could give me, and it's not the first time I've heard that about myself or other MLs. And the fact is, we're politically serious, and we're generally serious people. It's not that there aren't LARPy MLs. There's plenty of them, but look, I think that, yeah, I mean, I consider myself to be a rational, reasonable person, and I can get the stricter you are in your adherence to libertarianism, the more abhorrent the things I'm describing will sound. So I get that. What I would suggest, though, is that our point of view might not be as irreconcilable as it sounds on the surface level. And I think, there's two examples I can use. One is something you mentioned before, which is this outward acknowledgement of like, okay, yes, for like a functioning society with a functioning government, you do need a certain level of coercion. You do need a certain level of what you term slavery, or at the very least, control over people and their individual, self will, right? Um, and I think we both agree that it's just an objective fact. And so then it becomes sort of this, ironically, you started with military interventions, how many bodies, where's the line? My viewpoint on this is, well, where is the line in terms of how much of that is acceptable? And it might sound like we're far apart on that, but I would argue we're not as far apart as you might think, because in the current system, a certain amount of people are compelled to do A, B, and C for the government to run and for society to function at the level that we function now, which I think we both agree is incredibly high level, right? Like, this is the first world of the first world. Doesn't get much better than this. So, okay, we need a lot of coercion and all that. But I would argue that not all of that coercion is merely a product of like the government having power. I think you would agree, and you might, again, disagree on why this is, but a lot of it is huge corporations having control of it's just such a massive amount of the economy and the economic, apparatus, right? The means of production in this country, that a regular person is just born, into the ether, as it were. They don't have a lot of options in terms of being able to produce everything for themselves, even if they really wanted to. Like, society and the world are set up in such a way that you're going to have to work for one of these companies, and you're going to have to trade with these companies who own most of the stuff that you would call it a want, but I would say need to survive. And you're coerced in that way because you have a limited ability to take care of yourself from the outset because of capitalism. And I would say a system like communism, which can take care of your basic needs, right, actually gives you a little bit more freedom. And how it can that be possible if I'm commanding people to work? Well, in my, dream system, what we're also able to do is reduce the amount of time people have to work because we have so much of the population actively participating in labor. And so I think, with giving people more free time, giving people their basic needs, even if they are working, maybe not exactly doing the exact perfect thing they want to do, they have lots of free time to pursue that stuff. And, an economic foundation in which they can build on top of.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate the bridge trying to be built. I do think there's a lot of like pretty deep, perhaps irreconcilable differences. But I do want to ask you something, a proposal, I suppose. And I've asked every political ideology this proposal, and so far everybody's in agreement. Republicans, Libertarians, Democrats, Socialists, everybody I talk to, I say, "What if we did this?" And every single time, they have all said, "That's a great idea." So I want to ask you. I propose making it illegal for politicians to own stocks. What do you think?
Lactoid, I'm sorry, because I have just an absolute fucking
Yeah,
ridiculous troll.
no, no, no,
But
no. He's been in both of our chats. It's okay.
okay, okay. Try one more time. You propose you make
Mm.
it illegal. You said to.
Illegal for politicians to own stocks. No, if you're in a good position of government power, you don't get to have a financial interest in the outcome of large corporations.
Yeah. Okay. I mean. Okay. 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 I will say yes, just for the sake of argument.
Yeah, no, that's basically. I feel like that because when you say large corporations, I agree with you that there's a major problem right now. Large corporations having a lot of power. Now you would say, well, they're intrinsically bad because they have a lot of power. I think they're bad when they behave coercively, which we have examples of. Right? I'm not going to lie to you. I know about Coca-Cola shooting union workers, in Central and South America. It's not okay. I, I I think they should be held responsible. I think individuals who did it and the individuals who ordered it should be held responsible. Um, but um, the main problem comes from large corporations being tied with the government, right? In which the politicians have a financial interest in their outcome. The politicians own large amounts of stocks in these giant corporations. These you know these subsidies that are coming in vast amounts that are keeping these large corporations afloat. Oil subsidies, gas subsidies, agriculture subsidies that's keeping America fat, right? There's all these things that represents something that any reasonable person agrees is a problem. Just whether they're motivated to combat it is a different story. And I think a lot of this comes down to whether or not politicians have a personal financial interest in corporations. And if we made it illegal for politicians to have corporate investments or stocks, I think this would uh, I think this would solve a fuck ton of problems, right? You would have a government, politicians wouldn't be handing out subsidies to large corporations based on like, oh, that might boost their share price, so I might get something. And let's not pretend that that's not how they operate. So, I mean, everybody I know from every political persuasion agrees with this take, and I'm glad the Marxist-Leninist position that I know of here also agrees that we should do that. So that's a bridge I think we can build together of getting corporate power out of the hands of politicians.
Yeah, dude. Look, man. I'm not it's the same way I felt about like the student loan thing. Like I have a lot of chatters and other communists who were like, well, like they're trying to describe all of the problems with it, and the best anyone could come up with is, well, it just doesn't do enough. I'm for anything that helps the American people or anything that reduces the inequities in the system, just because I think that's the direction we should move in. So I would never be opposed to something like that. I mean, and you addressed a bunch of stuff there, the government and their which I agree with, the government and their support of corporations through subsidies and favorable legislation of various types, what have you. And then, yeah, also people in government having a vested financial interest in doing so. Lobbying is another example of this. Dark money, super PACs. I think that these are things that most sensible people at least acknowledge is a problem. Um, and I would say where I disagree with libertarians is this the outcome of a political system with central control, or is this the outcome of capitalism developing to a major extent under the political system and then hijacking it? And I would argue it's the latter. I think that capitalism, and it doesn't mean that capitalists are evil. That's not how Marx looked at it either. It's just objectively the way that the system grows and develops is such that capitalists need to take control of political power to reduce the government's ability to interfere with production and interfere with growth. And, they then, of course, by hijacking the government, can then use it to accelerate growth and, sustain growth and what have you. So, I think that what you and I both agree is a problem. We just disagree on where it came from, and that's probably why we disagree on how to resolve it.
You can address it though without having to abolish capitalism or even restrict it significantly. You know, my idea of, and I actually am like a incrementalist. I'm not like a libertarian revolution tomorrow kind of guy. I want to see like I'm really not as radical. I think you start off by saying that you don't think I'm as radical as you thought I am. That's probably true. You know, I am invested somewhat in like the system ideologically, right? And I think moving it slowly, gradually towards a more libertarian framework is my goal. And one of the ways to do that is constitutional protections, right? We have constitutional protections for speech, for gun rights, for all sorts of things, and we can address some of like the perverse incentives through, I think, the constitutional process. I would like to see a constitutional amendment passed saying that politicians can't own stocks, or if they can, it's like one pension fund that they don't even know what fucking stocks are in it, right? They have no control over that, and something along those lines. You can constitutionally address these issues without having to, burn down the whole system. Um, and and I think we're I think we're kind of nearing the end here. We're kind of wrapping things up in terms of trying to reach some agreement. Um, this isn't going to be an agreement, but I don't know if you knew this, it might be kind of interesting. But you said you had a libertarian phase in the past. Now you've moved towards Marxist Leninism. I had a Marxist Leninism phase, and I moved towards libertarianism. So I think maybe we sort of grew into this not based on we didn't read the literature or we didn't think about the ideology, but perhaps more about there's some pretty fundamental values here. I think that led me to my position and that led you to your position. Um, so um, yeah, I mean, my parents are Marxist Leninists. I grew up in a communist household, and really only about 2021, 22 did I manage to break away from the evil, and leave the dark side. So, and I'm still praying for you. I'll bring it back. We'll bring it back someday.
Yeah, I mean that's fascinating on a number of levels. The most of which to me is like growing up in a communist household. I mean, I didn't grow up in a conservative household. I grew up in I would say, largely liberal, but ultimately kind of apolitical environment. Um, and yeah, I mean, it surprises me, but it doesn't really at the same time. It surprises me, I guess, that like that someone had a similar path but moved in the opposite direction, at least in terms of their ideological development as an adult. Um, but it doesn't surprise me either in a sense of like, I do think libertarians, I do think populist conservatives, I do think MLs, I do think, anarchists, and I'll throw them in there even though, like, I agree with you, they're totally unserious idiots for the most part. Even like some of the more radical people, like far right people who I don't care for, but and very far radical left people, Maoist types who want to fucking burn shit down or whatever. All of us at least acknowledge that there's fundamental, deeply embedded problems in the system. And, it's just basically it's kind of come to light in this discussion with you that we just disagree on how to address those problems and, what urgency we should employ in addressing them. Like, do we really need to just sort of break this whole thing down? Is it breaking down as I suggest it is naturally? Or is it sustainable? And is it something through, as you call gradualism, we can reform and fix and make better? I do think this is a very politically exciting time in our country's history. I really, really do, because I think that we're coming up on a lot of change in a very short amount of time that will occur in the next, I would say, decade or so. Um, that's just my view. I could be way off base. I could be talking about the same shit in 30 years and nothing's changed. But I'm sort of, anticipating that I'm correct and that people like you and me and lots of other young people in this age range who have these far out there ideas relative to the American political orthodoxy, we're going to be the ones to shape how the country looks. And that's exciting.
Yeah, no, thank you, and for talking to me. Thank you for disagreeing with me, expressing your opinion. That's one thing that libertarians are all about: freedom of expression, freedom of speech, uh, and having a good conversation. So people can find you just non-smoker and in smoker that O is a zero, right? That's how you have it set up.
Right. The second O is a zero. And I just want to say before you run, and Lactoid TV, everybody, we gave him a shout out earlier. Go follow him. He's a good guy, has some interesting stuff to say. Um, you know, I hope to be on another panel with you again. And I hope that the more people I talk to, the more people can realize I'm not like a screeching tanky meme, like I can actually have a conversation. So,
Yeah, no,
yeah.
I was expecting you to be a lot angrier than you were. Very calm this discussion and very uh, conversational. So I really appreciate that, and um, I understand how panels can be as well sometimes. So when especially when other people are trying to jump in, it can raise the tensions a little bit. But no, that was good. Um, you really don't get along with Wick though, do you? Huh?
And some of that is me stirring the pot, a little bit intentionally. At least that's how it started. But look, ultimately, it's not Wick's fault. Even though I think he's a little dismissive and was being kind of a dick, but I did come at him a little hard. It's the people who populate Twitch, and particularly the political sphere. I mean, since that debate, I've had more than one person attempt to threaten me that they could essentially deplatform me at any time they feel like, and they have ascertained evidence, and they're willing to do this and that and the other, if whatever. And look, man, I hope I don't get banned, but I think that we should all be against that, and I would have liked
100%.
Wick to be a little firmer in that.
Yeah, and I know I don't know if he was specifically with you. I know that he has in the past very he's normally pretty good in the freedom of speech stuff. He is firmly against deplatforming. I'm firmly against deplatforming. I'm never gonna advocate for someone to get deplatformed from Twitch. I in fact my bar is probably even in order to deplatform somebody. I think my bar would probably even be higher than yours. I'm willing to allow a lot in the marketplace of ideas. But yeah, I'm sorry that's happening. I know you said something about your, what was it, PayPal or something getting canceled and
Right.
people being assholes. So no, that's never okay. Would never encourage that. Would never. It's not something that should happen on here. We want to have discussions about ideas, and the people want to hear it. So let's do proper market economics and give the people what they want, right?
This is why I like you guys, man. We can at least agree on some of those key things, at least with online discourse. All right, man. It was good talking to you, and hopefully we'll chat again soon.
Yeah, no,
Yeah,
good
no,
talking.
good talking.
All right, later.
Let's see if I can bounce all into my. Okay. Yeah, no, that was. Here's what I feel bad about a little bit because back on Monday when I shouted this out, this conversation with non-smoker, I shouted it out as it was going to be a shouting match because I firmly believe that's what it was going to be. The last panel, he was a very aggressive guy, and I even got frustrated a little bit, and I called him a discount Haas, which was mean, right? Shouldn't do that. Even though it's kind of funny. But this time around, I wanted to do a little bit of analysis here because he was much more conversational, much more reasonable. I do still think that Marxist Leninists are the most dangerous communists because what they advocate can actually happen, right? The stuff that like the hippies argue for is just not feasible whatsoever. You know, no one can work and everyone gets whatever. It's not going to happen, right? In order to have things, you have to have work, and he even admitted that he agreed with that, and he just said, well, we'll just force people to work, right? Forced labor, which is I think what we know that another word for that, which is slavery, right? It sounds like he's more comfortable with a higher level of that than I am, for sure. So, forced labor bad, by the way. I would advocate for. Um, the other thing I noticed from the discussion is a lot of uh, compromises for somebody who said he doesn't believe in like gradualism. I didn't get that feeling because there was a lot of compromises and a lot of pro market ideas. He was talking about how he wants to have some level of a market, how people can own property. He said he's okay with people owning property, owning their own businesses, like hiring employees, taking a cut of what they work, based on them agreeing to work for you. I mean, this stuff is very, this is like very moderate. This is as far as Marxist Leninists go, right? Because the last panel we were on, there was one guy who was literally like, "We're gonna get rid of money. We're gonna get rid of money, and the factories are just gonna make what we want. No one's gonna be forced to work. We're just gonna make, and we're gonna all have everything, and it's gonna be beautiful, right? That's crazy." Um, and then you have some people who are like, there will be a government bureau and they will direct you to make right. Then you got that element, and then you got this guy who's saying, yeah, we're gonna have people own their own businesses and have employees, and maybe if it gets a big corporation, there's bureaucrats on the board of directors, which is I don't agree with that. Obviously, that's terrible. We shouldn't have bureaucrats on boards of directors, but um, at least on like the smaller level, uh, I he's okay with markets and he's okay with capitalism. That is capitalism, right? Freedom of association, making agreements with people to trade things, giving people something in exchange for something like that freely. That is capitalism, and he's okay with it. I always thought Marxist Leninists hated capitalism, that it was the antithesis of capitalism. But I don't. But yeah, he's not. And maybe this is just me doing what I'm critical of other people doing to me, which is when they say like, "Oh, you're not a real libertarian. Like I thought you would have more libertarian beliefs, yada yada." Um, maybe I'm doing that a little bit right now when I'm saying that I'm surprised at his opinions because maybe he also doesn't value identity. Maybe he is more pro market, but just on some other things. That's why he calls himself a Marxist Leninist. Although I don't know why that would politically or even like convenience wise benefit somebody, because who wants to be known as a tankie unless you're actually a crazy tankie? Which I don't. This conversation, I didn't think he was that crazy, other than saying that other than the Korean War opinions that he has. The Korean War was justified, by the way. It's stopping communists from invading a large group of people and enslaving them is a good thing. Just look at North Korea compared to South Korea. Um, so he's definitely not the standard Marxist Leninist based on that conversation. He's definitely more of just a and maybe he was hiding his power level. Maybe he was, because I think he even said, which I understand, right? There's only so much you can say in a stream. Maybe he actually, if this was YouTube or something else, you'd be fucking, crazy memes about shit and I don't know. Apparently there was some Holodomor opinions a while ago. I don't know. I just, who knows. But that interaction, that was a pretty moderate leftist compared to what I was expecting. But it was pretty good. I got to, express why slavery was wrong to his audience. I go back and forth here on the tabs, and his audience was absolutely, freaking out about some things. Yeah, I think he's more of a China guy. I agree with that. I think he is a little bit more of a China stan in terms of communism with capitalistic characteristics. I don't know the rule. I mean, I don't know all the rules in China. Maybe he's okay. Maybe in China, he's like the reason he's okay with like small businesses is because in China they also have that. I don't know. He also said he's more okay with authoritarianism. I mean, that's how how do I? That's not. There's no debating there. He just said, "Yeah, I'm more okay with authoritarianism than you are." Yeah, I think that's that's probably the main difference. he it's you can't argue with somebody when they just agree with the difference and they just that's they just embrace the label, right? Right? You argue with like an ANCOM, no, it's actually authoritarian what you're doing. No, he's like, yeah, I'm okay with that. Fuck, okay. I guess we agree. I guess we agree. You're more authoritarian than I am. We are in agreement. Um, I love that part. That was a great part. Um, anyway, good discussion. A lot more chill. So you guys got to find angry people if you guys want fireworks. You got to find angry people who don't care about their optics and don't care about their positions and just want to scream at me. I'll try to tone them down. I'll try to make them see reason. Um, oh boy, that'd be an interesting stream. Red Charlotte. I actually had a debate with Commie Boy at the time. It's SDL, Socialism Done Left. I had a debate with him a long time ago regarding healthcare. Um, that was really good. I know they were in that same community, although he's kind of fell off the face of the planet after some other leftist outed him for offensive jokes he was making in DGG. And the jokes were offensive. They were funny. I don't know if I'm going to be canceled for saying that, but they were funny jokes. You can go look at them right now. Still, they're still up in DGG. Um, they were really funny jokes. They were bad. They were bad jokes. I don't endorse the message if there was a serious one, which I don't think there was. But they're funny. Anyway, thank you guys so much for tuning in and listening to this grand debate with non-smoker, the most capitalistic tankie I've ever had a conversation with. And I even used to hang out on Finbol's commune server, and those tankies were, and maybe, okay, this is why I had the preconceptions, right? Because those tankies that I argued with were fucking tankies, right? They're gonna abolish money. They're gonna, kill the cool. They're gonna roll in with the tanks. They're gonna, make crazy shit, right? They were the tankies, and so when I've debated 18 of them in a row, I have this opinion, but maybe that's just Finbal's commune. Maybe that's just the community, and maybe there's other communities of, leftists disagreeing with each other. Who would be surprised? Um, I think the ultimate thing, though, before we move on, that I just need to emphasize here is that the ideology that he advocates for ultimately is more coercion and more slavery. Marxist Leninists argue for a bad system, and they argue for it in pragmatic ways, which is a problem. So, you know, it, me giving him compliments and agreeing with his market-based systems and acknowledging that he was a pretty chill guy, it's not an endorsement of his political positions. Um, at least not all of them. The market stuff was pretty cool, and the gun stuff was pretty cool too. Guns are cool, but other than that, a lot of the stuff wasn't good. So don't go down that road, guys. Stick to the side of liberty. He even said he's more okay with authoritarianism. We don't want that. We don't like authoritarianism here. All the bros are pro liberty over here. So we're gonna rate on out. We're gonna rate on out to. We're gonna rate on out to Rob Noer, because I've heard of him and I'm pretty sure he's a pretty, isn't he like a, he's just like a flat out Republican, I'm pretty sure, just like a milquetoast Republican. So probably not a lot of edgy takes, but maybe not. Maybe he'll surprise me. All right, Rob is great. Good. We'll shoot on and over to Rob. We'll rate on out. Thank you all for tuning in to this discussion. If you liked the content, give me a follow. I appreciate everybody who's given me a follow. I appreciate everyone who's given me a sub and bits. Thank you so much for the bits today, Feder. I really appreciate it as always. All that supports the stream goes right back into the stream. We're gonna be, keeping it going. Hopefully, this grows into something big, something great. Kat, you joined right at the tail end. I'm so sorry, but good news. This won't be the last time I stream. I promise. Um, so if you haven't given me a follow yet, if you hit the follow, then you'll see the next time I'll stream, and it will be not in the distant future. It'll be coming. I promise you, it'll be coming. So, but maybe you guys will enjoy Rob. Um, we'll we will we will rate on out. Is Hassan raising money for Turkey right now? Never mind. We don't even want to. We don't even want to say his name. All right, rating on out. OERR. Oh, and one more thing. Obviously, give me a follow if you guys want to see more debates, more content. But if you guys also want to talk, join my Discord. The link is right here in the Twitch. The Twitch right here in my Twitch channel. Click on it and shoot me questions. And maybe we'll just maybe we'll even do a panel. Maybe that'll happen pretty soon. I don't know. That's a hint. That might be happening at some point pretty soon. But
all he needs to know is, oh, there's a disparity between men and women. Yep, that proves bigotry. That's the same level of analysis that we have when it goes to race. I'm not. You keep using words fallacy
again. Rob, let him respond. Let him respond, Rob.
You're making the raw data fallacy again. When you conduct research on, say, arrest disparities between men and women, you have to look at things like actual convictions. You also have to look at things like the amount of interactions with police. All this research accounts for that. You're never going to see a study that publishes just raw data with no adjustments to the data. So yeah, if you look at this, if you account for the amount of interactions with